I've been managing a totally AI-generated podcast for almost 2 months now, and the results of this experiment are pretty shocking. In just a minute, I'm going to share the analytics from my show. But before I share the stats, I want to take a step back and share the reasoning for doing all of this in the first place. Then I'll share some stats. And in the coming weeks, I'll show you exactly how to take my process and implement it into your human podcast, or generate your own AI podcast if you really want to. So I'm sure the big question you're asking yourself, or maybe screaming at the computer at this point, is why an AI podcast? What's the point? Now, I just want to set the record straight. I don't think AI is coming for podcasters' jobs. And to be honest, I don't think that's really coming anytime soon. And I'll share why I believe that shortly. But the idea that an AI-generated show could have any sort of success had me intrigued. But the main reason for the show was to see if total automation was possible. And how could I create something that people found valuable with as few touches as possible? I think it's also good to note that I wasn't going to go spend thousands or hundreds of dollars to get this thing produced when I didn't know if I was going to get any kind of return that I wanted from it. So this process had to be something that was affordable for me. And I guess the last question to be answered is, would anyone listen to a podcast that was entirely AI generated? So to help answer that last question, I took just Facebook groups and I asked, would you listen to a podcast if it was entirely created using AI? The results, as I'm sure you can imagine, were pretty mixed. I got a healthy dose of comments like this: AI about AI for AI, get out of here. And some that just said flat out no. And in a way, I can't fault them. But I also got some comments like this: I would have said no had I not watched the video you shared, but wow, that was a pretty slick looking and sounding video. And it's tough to listen to an AI talking head for too long, but yours was nice. I expected many people to be hesitant about the whole thing in general, but I was actually pleasantly surprised that people were interested, or at the very least intrigued, to at least listen to the show, especially after hearing and seeing that first episode. But what do the hard stats and numbers say? Now, before I share my stats of the AI briefing, I feel like this is a good time to bring up two important facts about this whole experiment. The first point, and this is one that ties back to the beginning of the video where I said I don't think podcasters really have to worry about AI taking the industry over. The biggest argument against AI-generated podcasts and content is that there's no human involvement. Listeners like to hear personal stories, and they want to feel connected to the content and the person sharing that content. No matter how good that AI-generated stuff is, you can't recreate that emotional connection, especially when you know that the content is artificially curated and created. And I do agree with that. And the second point I want to make came based off of one of the comments I received on one of the more popular episodes. This person said, in 20 seconds, I could tell it was AI generated. Definitely selecting do not recommend channel. And I want to set the record straight because at no point was I or am I trying to trick people into thinking that this podcast is hosted by a human being. I wanted people to know that it was AI generated. So that's why at the top of all of my episodes, the host reads, I'm your AI host, Mick.
I'm your AI host, Mick.
And then leads into the episode, which admittedly I thought was going to be enough, but apparently it's not based off of that comment. So what I did next was I added a disclaimer to all of the show notes and video descriptions for the episodes and basically said this is AI. In this crazy and fascinating direction that we're moving with AI and technology, I truly believe that full transparency is extremely important. And AI should be used as a tool to enhance your work, not deceive others. So with all that said, with that out of the way, let's take a look at the numbers. So when I first launched the show, I was planning on it being a weekly video podcast. And looking at the numbers from these first few weeks of it being a weekly show, you can see that the views weren't bad for a new show. But I wanted to see if I could get substantial results much quicker, and a weekly show just wasn't going to do it. And since I was working towards full automation, I thought, why not try to make this a daily news podcast as opposed to a weekly roundup? And to do this, time wouldn't really be a constraint, but money would. I'm using HeyGen to create all of the video versions of this podcast, and if I was going to turn this into a daily show, that cost for HeyGen would run up extremely high very quick. So I decided to transition to an audio-only format for 6 days of the week, and then 1 day of the week being a video format. So from the moment I took that show daily until the time that I'm recording this, the podcast has racked up 4.4 thousand views and almost 68 hours of watch time. And keep in mind, this is not a large channel. At the time of recording this, I have 370 some subscribers total on this channel. And speaking of the channel, if you're finding this conversation interesting and you want to dig deeper into the inner workings of this show, be sure to hit that subscribe button. So the AI briefing in total has 4.5 thousand views and almost 69 hours of watch time, starting from the very end of March until now. And of those 4.5 thousand views, 2,000 of them have come from a single episode. And there are several in here that have gotten a couple hundred views, and then more that have gotten just a couple dozen. My audio-only platforms are a slightly different story. My stats showing on Spotify for podcasters, where the podcast is hosted, is only showing 247 all-time listens, about 4 listens per episode, and an audience size of about 39 people. But why is that? Well, the total number of podcast listeners is estimated to reach 504.9 million in 2024, which is a massive increase from the previous years. which is great for podcasters. When you compare that to the monthly YouTube users, it doesn't even come close. There are 2.7 billion people who use YouTube every single month. I got this information from Perplexity AI, which pulled together a whole slew of resources and websites. So if you want to check that out, I'll put a link to that Perplexity chat conversation in the description down below. So there's about 5.4 times the number of users on YouTube than podcast listeners on platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And I do think it's fair to say that there are a good chunk of people who are listening and watching podcasts on YouTube as opposed to podcasting apps. So we're kind of comparing apples to oranges here. But let's just say I take my 247 listens on the podcast apps and I multiply that by 5.4. That puts me at 1,333 listens, which still doesn't even come close to what I'm getting on YouTube right now. So why even bring this up? Because I think that it's important to note that YouTube is the second largest search engine in the world behind Google. And podcasters have a notoriously bad reputation when it comes to discoverability. So it would just naturally make sense that content published on YouTube would have a much better chance of being found than just, say, a podcast app. Which I believe is not just a valuable lesson for me, but all podcasters out there. Why put all of your eggs in the podcast app basket when majority of people are grabbing their eggs from the YouTube basket? And now this brings me to my thoughts on the whole thing. I do understand that there are certain elements that could be contributing to the success of the podcast that might not fare well for other podcasters or maybe even most podcasters. The first one being that I'm pulling from the latest news in AI. So there's a good chance that I'm benefiting from the topics and the things people are searching related in the AI news industry. And then with everything going on in AI, I feel like there's that certain allure that makes people at least interested into seeing if it's any good, seeing if it's something that they would listen to, or maybe just so that they can come into the comments and bash the show for being AI generated. And that said, I do know that there are things that I could be doing to make this show better than what it is right now. I am reviewing the content. I am making minor tweaks to it, so it's not completely AI generated, but I could be a little bit more hands-on in that process and help curate that content a little more. And additionally, I could be doing a much better job at actually promoting the show. Almost all of the traffic that I've had to the show has come as a result of people searching online or in the podcast apps or on YouTube specifically. But I do actually think that this show has been a success so far. And if you want to take a listen to the AI briefing for yourself, I'll put a link down in the description of this video so you can go check that out. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on the show overall. And I will continue to produce the show and monitor it for the foreseeable future. And hell, maybe I'll find a way to monetize this thing even. But through this whole process, I have learned a lot about AI and automation that I truly think can help podcasters and creators, even if you're not going after creating a fully AI-generated podcast. And the rest of the series is dedicated to exactly that. Over the next few weeks, I'll be sharing how I used AI to help plan the episodes, so things like titles, show descriptions, cover art, all of that. Then we'll look at how I use Feedly and Perplexity AI to source the information and the stories that I was going to cover in this content, which both of these platforms can be a valuable tool for podcasters needing to do research for their shows. After that, we'll get into creating AI agents that will do a lot of the dirty work for us, things like creating scripts and writing show notes and titles, things like that. And then we'll look at creating AI voices or even cloning your own voice with an extremely powerful tool called ElevenLabs. Then we'll take a look at video and avatar creation using a platform called HeyGen. And then finally, we'll tie all of this together with some of my favorite automation tools. So if that is of interest to you, like this video, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next week.